Picture this: a time when the map of the world was a patchwork of kingdoms, each one vying for power, each one writing its name in the annals of history with blood, gold, and ambition. These were the medieval realms where crowns were won and lost, where dynasties rose like towering cathedrals only to fade into legend. Some ruled vast territories, their influence stretching across continents, while others burned brightly for just a moment before vanishing into the shadows. But all of them, in their own way, shaped the world we live in today. This is the story of 30 of the most powerful kingdoms the medieval era ever saw: their glory, their downfall, and the indelible marks they left behind. What makes these kingdoms so fascinating isn't just their wealth or their armies, though those were certainly impressive. It's the human drama at the heart of it all: the kings and queens who dreamed too big, the battles that turned the tide of history, the alliances that crumbled under the weight of betrayal. These weren't just political entities. They were living, breathing worlds where culture, art, and innovation thrived until, one day, they didn't. Think of the Byzantine Empire, a beacon of learning and power that stood for over 1,000 years before finally succumbing to the Ottomans. Or the Kingdom of Mali, whose wealth in gold was so vast it became the stuff of legend. These stories aren't just footnotes in a textbook, they're epic sagas of ambition, resilience, and sometimes heartbreaking failure. So why should we care about kingdoms that vanished centuries ago? Because their echoes are still with us. The borders of modern nations, the languages we speak, even the conflicts that simmer today, many of them trace their roots back to these medieval powers. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a journey into the forces that shaped our world. Over the next 30 kingdoms, we'll uncover how they rose, why they fell, and what they can teach us about power, legacy, and the fleeting nature of greatness. Whether it's the Mongol Empire's unmatched conquests or the quiet demise of Burgundy, each story is a piece of the puzzle. So settle in, because history is about to come alive in ways you've never imagined. The Carolingian Empire didn't just rise, it exploded onto the medieval stage like a supernova, lighting up a Europe that had been stumbling through the Dark Ages. At its heart was Charlemagne, a king who stood head and shoulders above his contemporaries, both literally and figuratively, towering at 6 feet 3 inches in an era when most men barely reached 5 feet. He was as much a force of nature as he was a ruler. But his true greatness lay not in his physical stature, but in his vision, a dream of reuniting the fractured pieces of Western Europe under one banner. When Pope Leo III placed the imperial crown on his head on Christmas Day in the year 800, it wasn't just a coronation, it was the rebirth of an idea. For the first time since Rome's collapse, someone could legitimately claim to rule a unified Christian West. Charlemagne didn't just conquer territory, he built systems. His royal courts became centers of learning where monks meticulously copied ancient texts, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. He standardized weights and measures, reformed the chaotic legal systems of his realms, and even attempted to create a unified currency. Yet for all its brilliance, the Carolingian Empire carried the seeds of its own destruction. Charlemagne's successors lacked his unifying vision, squabbling over territories until the empire split into 3 parts with the Treaty of Verdun in 843. Meanwhile, Viking longships appeared on the horizon like a storm, raiding deep inland along Europe's rivers. These weren't just raids, they were systematic dismantlings of Carolingian power, striking monasteries that served as the empire's administrative centers. What makes this rise and fall so poignant is how close Charlemagne came to creating something lasting. His empire didn't collapse because his ideas failed, but because the forces pulling Europe apart, local loyalties, succession disputes, external threats, proved stronger than his ability to bind them together. The Carolingian Renaissance showed what Europe could be, making its eventual fragmentation all the more tragic. Even today, we see echoes of Charlemagne's legacy in modern borders, legal traditions, and the very idea of a united Europe. His empire may have shattered, but the pieces never forgot they were once part of something greater. The Byzantine Empire's story isn't just about collapse, it's about survival against impossible odds. While Western Europe stumbled through centuries of upheaval, Constantinople stood unshaken, its mighty Theodosian walls defying invaders for generations. This was no ordinary kingdom. It was the last living thread connecting the medieval world to ancient Rome. Emperors still called themselves Caesar, laws still drew from Justinian's code, and chariots still raced in the hippodrome as they had 1,000 years earlier. But by the 1200s, the cracks were beginning to show. Nothing illustrates this fragility more starkly than the Fourth Crusade's brutal betrayal. In 1204, an army of crusaders supposedly marching to reclaim Jerusalem turned on their Christian allies instead. Venetian merchants hungry for trade dominance manipulated the crusaders into sacking Constantinople itself. For 3 days, the city that had preserved classical knowledge through the Dark Ages was pillaged by fellow Christians. Libraries burned, ancient statues were melted down for coin, and the mighty bronze horses of the hippodrome were hauled away to Venice. The empire never fully recovered. Though the Byzantines retook their capital 50 years later, they were shadows of their former selves, ruling little more than the city walls while Turkish beyliks grew stronger in Anatolia. What makes this decline so tragic is how preventable much of it was. Byzantine emperors wasted precious resources fighting over theological differences while Ottoman armies grew stronger. They squandered their navy, once the terror of the Mediterranean, until Turkish ships controlled the Bosporus. Even their legendary walls, which had stood for a millennium, were finally breached not through lack of engineering, but because they'd neglected to update their defenses against gunpowder. When Mehmed II brought his massive cannons to Constantinople's gates in 1453, some of his weapons could hurl stones weighing over 1,000 pounds. Yet in their final hours, the Byzantines reminded the world why they'd endured so long. Emperor Constantine XI, knowing defeat was certain, refused to flee. He tore off his imperial regalia and charged into the breach with his soldiers, disappearing into legend. The empire died as it had lived, with Roman dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. Today, walking through Istanbul's streets, you can still touch stones laid by Byzantine masons 1,000 years ago. Their empire may be gone, but its legacy lingers in our laws, our religions, and our very idea of what civilization means. At the height of its power, the Abbasid Caliphate wasn't just a kingdom, it was a dazzling intellectual supernova. Imagine Baghdad in the 9th century, where the streets hummed with scholars translating Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, and Indian mathematics into Arabic. The House of Wisdom wasn't merely a library, it was the medieval equivalent of Silicon Valley, NASA, and Oxford University rolled into one. Here, Al-Khwarizmi invented algebra. Astronomers calculated the Earth's circumference with startling accuracy, and physicians pioneered surgical techniques still used today. This wasn't just a golden age of Islamic civilization, it was humanity's shared renaissance centuries before Europe's. Yet the very openness that fueled this brilliance sowed the seeds of the Caliphate's vulnerability. As Mongol armies swept across Asia in the 13th century, the Abbasids remained absorbed in scholarly debates while their military defenses grew stagnant. When Hulagu Khan's forces arrived at Baghdad's gates in 1258, the city's famed libraries and observatories offered no protection. Survivors wrote of the Tigris River running black with ink from countless thrown manuscripts, then red with the blood of scholars. The Mongols didn't just conquer Baghdad, they systematically erased centuries of accumulated knowledge, burning books to heat their bathhouses and piling skulls into pyramids as grim trophies. What makes this collapse so haunting is its paradox. The Abbasids' greatest strength became their fatal weakness. Their obsession with preserving global knowledge left them unprepared for a world where raw power trumped wisdom. While Mongol horsemen trained with new composite bows, Abbasid astronomers perfected star charts beautiful but useless against siege engines. The lesson isn't that knowledge is fragile, but that civilizations must balance enlightenment with vigilance. Today, as we digitize libraries and debate open access to information, the Abbasid story whispers a warning. Culture thrives not just by accumulating knowledge, but by defending the space where knowledge can grow. Their legacy lives on in every university, every scientific journal, and every time we describe the stars with Arabic names like Aldebaran and Betelgeuse, reminders that even the darkest invasions can't fully extinguish light. The Viking kingdoms didn't just raid, they rewrote the map of Europe. Picture longships slicing through morning mist, not just to plunder, but to plant roots. What began as seasonal attacks blossomed into permanent settlements, trade networks stretching from Newfoundland to Constantinople, and thrones seized in distant lands. By the 11th century, Viking rulers like C, not the Great, didn't just command war bands, they presided over a North Sea empire stitching together Denmark, England, and Norway. This wasn't the work of mindless marauders, it was the calculated ambition of a culture that mastered both axe and diplomacy. Yet their greatest strength, fierce independence, became their undoing. Viking society thrived on decentralized power, local chieftains ruling through personal loyalty, not bureaucratic systems. While this flexibility let them adapt swiftly, it left their realms vulnerable when faced with centralized kingdoms. A king like Sinat could dominate through sheer charisma, but without strong institutions, his empire fractured after his death. Meanwhile, the very faith that helped them integrate into Europe eroded their identity. Christianity softened the warrior ethos that had driven their expansion. Monasteries replaced mead halls as centers of influence, and the old gods Odin, Thor, Freyja faded into folklore. The irony, the Vikings' success sowed the seeds of their decline. As they settled in places like Normandy and Sicily, they adopted the languages and customs of those they'd conquered. Their descendants became French dukes, English kings, even Byzantine emperors, but they were no longer Vikings. By the time Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, died at Stamford Bridge in 1066, the age of longships and shield walls was already slipping into legend. What lingers isn't just the memory of their raids, but their astonishing adaptability. They didn't just take, they learned, traded, and transformed every society they touched. Modern cities from Dublin to Kiev owe their beginnings to Viking traders, while parliamentary traditions in Iceland hint at their experiments with governance. Their story isn't about brute force, but the paradox of conquest. To truly endure, even the fiercest warriors must lay down their swords. The Holy Roman Empire was history's greatest misnomer, not holy, not Roman, and barely an empire. While its name conjured images of Caesar's legions or Charlemagne's united Christendom, the reality was a chaotic quilt of bishoprics, duchies, and free cities, all jealously guarding their privileges. Emperors wore crowns but often wielded less real power than a modern mayor. Take Frederick Barbarossa, the fiery red-bearded ruler whose very nickname, Redbeard, hinted at both his ambition and his temper. Though he spent decades trying to bend Italy and Germany to his will, his greatest legacy might be the time he drowned in a shallow river during the Third Crusade, his heavy armor dragging him under, a fitting metaphor for an empire forever sinking under its own contradictions. What made this patchwork so unstable wasn't just weak rulers, it was a system designed to fail. Unlike France or England, where kings gradually centralized power, the Holy Roman Empire's princes and bishops insisted on electing each emperor, ensuring no dynasty could grow too strong. The Golden Bull of 1356 formalized this mess, turning imperial elections into a free-for-all where votes were literally bought with castles and titles. Meanwhile, cities like Nuremberg and Cologne operated as independent republics, minting their own coins and ignoring imperial decrees. This wasn't governance, it was anarchy with fancy titles. Yet there's a twisted genius to its longevity. For all its dysfunction, the empire survived nearly 1,000 years precisely because it demanded so little from its parts. Local rulers kept their power, peasants kept their traditions, and the empire became less a state than a vague idea, like a medieval European Union without the bureaucracy. When Voltaire quipped it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, he missed the point. Its strength lay in its weakness, allowing regions as different as Flanders and Bohemia to coexist under a shared fiction. This fragile balance foreshadowed modern Europe's divisions. The 30 Years' War, which began as a squabble between Protestant and Catholic states within the empire, spiraled into a continent-wide massacre. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 didn't just end the fighting, it enshrined the principle that local rulers could defy central authority, a notion that echoes in today's debates over national sovereignty versus European integration. The empire's ghost lingers in Germany's federal structure, in Switzerland's cantons, even in the European Union's struggles to balance unity and diversity. Perhaps its true lesson is this: sometimes the mightiest legacy isn't conquest, but learning how to hold chaos together with sheer stubbornness. The Anjavan Empire was less a unified kingdom than a sprawling family feud waiting to happen. At its peak under Henry II, this patchwork realm stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, a dizzying collection of lands held together by marriage alliances, battlefield victories, and sheer force of personality. Henry wasn't just a king, he was a legal revolutionary who standardized English common law, a military strategist who could outmaneuver rivals twice his age, and a man whose temper was legendary. But his greatest failure wasn't on the battlefield, it was in his own household. Nothing captures the empire's tragic arc better than the Christmas court of 1182. Henry had summoned his family to celebrate at Chinon Castle, expecting obedience from his rebellious sons. Instead, he found a nest of vipers. Young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey had secretly allied with their mother, Elena of Aquitaine, and even King Philip of France, their father's sworn enemy. The confrontation that followed wasn't just political, it was Shakespearean in its personal betrayal. Elena, once Henry's fiery partner in power, now backed their son's revolt. The king, who had tamed barons and reformed legal systems, couldn't control his own blood. The irony: Henry had built this empire through brilliant marriages and calculated wars, only to watch it unravel because he refused to share power. He treated his sons as pawns rather than partners, denying them meaningful authority while they chafed for glory. Richard, later called Lionheart, spent years fighting his own father just to claim the inheritance he'd been promised. When Henry finally died in 1189, exhausted and broken, legend says his last words were, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." What makes the Angevin collapse so poignant is how unnecessary it was. Unlike empires that fell to invaders or economic collapse, this one was sabotaged by its own dynasty. Richard's obsession with crusading drained the treasury. John's tyranny lost Normandy to France, and within 2 generations, the continental holdings had shrunk to a sliver of their former glory. Yet their legacy endures in unexpected ways. The Magna Carta, forced upon John by his barons, became the cornerstone of constitutional government. Sometimes the mightiest kingdoms plant seeds that only grow after they've fallen. The Mongol Empire didn't just conquer, it rewrote the rules of what an empire could be. At its height, it stretched from the rice paddies of Vietnam to the forests of Hungary, a staggering 12 million square miles united under the hooves of Mongol horses. This wasn't just expansion, it was a force of nature, a whirlwind that toppled ancient dynasties and connected distant worlds for the first time. Genghis Khan's genius wasn't just in his ruthless military tactics, it was in his ability to absorb. Conquered engineers built siege engines for him, captured scribes administered his territories, and defeated soldiers swelled his ranks. The Mongols didn't just destroy, they repurposed everything in their path, turning enemies into assets with terrifying efficiency. Yet the very scale of their success became their undoing. Imagine trying to govern a realm where news from one end took months to reach the other, where local rebellions could flare up long before the Khan even heard of them. The Mongols solved this with an ingenious system of relay stations, the Yam, where riders could swap horses and race messages across continents at speeds Europe wouldn't match for centuries. But technology couldn't overcome human nature. When Genghis died in 1227, his sons divided the empire like an inheritance, setting the stage for rival khanates. By the time Kublai Khan ruled from Beijing, the Golden Horde in Russia and the Ilkhanate in Persia were already drifting apart, each adapting to local customs and faiths until Mongol meant something different in every corner of Eurasia. The irony, their greatest strength, adaptability, sealed their fragmentation. In China, Kublai embraced Confucian rituals. In Persia, his cousins converted to Islam. The empire that had united steppe warriors, Chinese bureaucrats, and Persian scholars under one banner now struggled to define what that banner even stood for. When the Black Death swept through in the 14th century, it didn't just kill people, it shattered the trade networks that had been the empire's lifeblood. The Mongols had built history's greatest land bridge between civilizations, only to watch it crumble under the weight of its own complexity. What lingers isn't just the memory of their conquests, but their unintended gifts. The Pax Mongolica, their enforced peace, let ideas flow freely across continents. Gunpowder, printing, even the humble noodle traveled farther in a few Mongol decades than they had in centuries before. Their fall teaches a paradoxical lesson. Sometimes the mightiest empires aren't undone by weakness, but by the impossibility of sustaining their own ambition. They didn't collapse, they evaporated, leaving behind a world forever changed by the wind that had once blown so fiercely across the steppes. The Khmer Empire didn't just build temples, they carved an entire civilization from the jungle's embrace. Angkor Wat, its crown jewel, wasn't merely a religious site. It was the beating heart of an empire that mastered water in a land ruled by monsoons. Picture a metropolis larger than medieval Paris, crisscrossed by canals and reservoirs so precise they could have been designed by modern engineers. The Khmer kings didn't just conquer nature, they collaborated with it, turning seasonal floods into a hydraulic network that fed rice paddies for millions. This wasn't just architecture, it was alchemy, transforming swamp into wealth. Yet the very ingenuity that sustained Angkor also sealed its fate. Those intricate waterways, engineered to perfection for centuries, grew brittle under the weight of their own success. As populations swelled, forests were felled to expand farmland, disrupting the delicate balance of rainfall and runoff. sediment-choked reservoirs, canals ran dry, and by the 1400s, a changing climate brought droughts that no amount of engineering could mitigate. The empire that had tamed water now withered without it. Meanwhile, rivals circled like monsoon clouds. The Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya, armed with gunpowder weapons the Khmer never adopted, sacked Angkor not once but repeatedly, looting treasures and leaving the grand capital to the creeping vines. What makes this fall so haunting is its slow-motion inevitability. Unlike empires shattered by sudden invasions or revolts, the Khmer unraveled stitch by stitch. Farmers abandoned parched fields, priests drifted from crumbling temples, and the knowledge to maintain those miraculous waterworks faded like inscriptions in sandstone. By the time Portuguese explorers stumbled upon Angkor in the 16th century, they assumed its cyclopean ruins must have been built by some lost ancient race, not the ancestors of the people still living nearby. But stone has a way of outlasting even the grandest ambitions. Today, as laser scans reveal vast urban sprawls beneath the jungle canopy, we're only beginning to grasp the Khmer's true scale. Their legacy isn't just in the haunting beauty of Angkor's towers, but in the warning etched into their stones. No empire, no matter how brilliant, is immune to the planet's whispers. They remind us that sustainability isn't a modern idea, it's an ancient lesson written in water and forgotten at our peril. The Mali Empire didn't just trade gold, it weaponized it. When Mansa Musa, the 9th ruler of Mali, embarked on his Hajj to Mecca in 1324, he didn't travel like an ordinary pilgrim. His caravan stretched as far as the eye could see, 60,000 attendants, 12,000 slaves draped in Persian silk, and camels laden with so much gold dust that its value crashed local economies for years after he passed through. In Cairo, he gave away so much wealth that the price of gold plummeted, and it took over a decade for markets to recover. This wasn't just a religious journey, it was the medieval equivalent of a billionaire flexing so hard he broke the global economy. Yet beneath the glittering surface, cracks were forming. Mali's wealth came from 3 legendary gold mines, Bambuk, Bur, and Galam, but controlling these remote sites required constant military campaigns against rebellious tribes and rival kingdoms. The empire's vastness, stretching from the Atlantic coast to Timbuktu, made it nearly impossible to govern efficiently. Provincial governors, enriched by the gold trade, began acting like independent rulers, siphoning wealth away from the capital. And then there was the salt, Mali's other great commodity. The mines of Tagheza produced slabs so valuable they were traded ounce for ounce with gold. But controlling these arid hellscapes drained resources just as fast as the gold replenished them. The cruelest twist, Mansa Musa's legendary generosity backfired spectacularly. By flooding the Mediterranean with Malian gold, he inadvertently alerted European powers to West Africa's staggering wealth. Within a century, Portuguese caravels were probing the African coast, not for trade but for conquest. Meanwhile, the Songhai people, long considered vassals, saw Mali's weakening grip as their chance to rise. By the late 1400s, the empire that had once awed the world was reduced to a shadow, its gold mines exhausted or seized, its great cities like Timbuktu now thriving under new masters. Mali's story teaches us that wealth without systems is just glitter on the wind. Their universities and libraries, some holding hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, were marvels of the medieval world, but without strong institutions to protect them, they faded into obscurity. The empire's legacy isn't just in the gold that once dazzled sultans and kings, but in the warning it leaves for every prosperous society. Treasure without stability is a mirage. Today, as Timbuktu's ancient texts are painstakingly restored, we're reminded that real power lies not in what you mine from the earth, but what you build with it. The kingdom of Ghana didn't collapse with a roar. It faded like a whisper lost in the desert wind. At its peak, this was the empire that turned gold into legend, where caravans carrying salt from the Sahara met traders bearing gold dust from the south, exchanging fortunes under the watchful eyes of Ghana's rulers. The king presided over this wealth with calculated secrecy. His people weren't even allowed to own gold nuggets, only dust. This wasn't just economics, it was theater, a performance of power designed to keep outsiders guessing about the true source of Ghana's riches. But no amount of gold could shield Ghana from the storm brewing in the north. The Almoravids, a zealous Berber movement, saw Ghana's prosperity as an affront to their puritanical vision of Islam. In 1076, they launched a holy war against the kingdom, not just for territory but for souls. Ghana's rulers had tolerated Islam for generations, allowing Muslim traders to build communities alongside traditional believers. The Almoravids, however, demanded conversion or conquest. Their cavalry, hardened by desert warfare, struck like a sandstorm, sacking the capital of Koum by sail and disrupting the delicate balance of trade that had fed Ghana's coffers for centuries. The true tragedy wasn't the invasion itself, but what followed. The Almoravids couldn't hold Ghana's territory, but their attacks severed the kingdom's lifelines. Gold caravans, fearing raids, began bypassing Ghana altogether, rerouting to emerging powers like Mali. Worse, the Almoravids' scorched earth tactics disrupted the fragile ecology of the Sahel. Wells were poisoned, oases abandoned, and the once thriving trade hubs along Ghana's borders withered into ghost towns. Without trade, Ghana's kings lost their leverage over regional chiefs, who defected one by one like sand slipping through fingers. What makes Ghana's fall so haunting is how little we truly know about it. Unlike Rome or Constantinople, there were no chroniclers to document its last days. The empire didn't so much collapse as dissolve, its people scattering into new identities, its cities reclaimed by the savannah. Archaeologists still debate whether the Almoravids caused Ghana's decline or merely accelerated an inevitable unraveling. Perhaps the kingdom had grown complacent, too reliant on a single trade network, or maybe climate shifts, hinted at in oral traditions of droughts and failed harvests, played the silent killer. Ghana's legacy lingers in the most unexpected places. The very word Ghana became a title for later West African rulers, a ghost of its former glory. Its story warns us that wealth built on a single pillar, whether gold, oil, or trade routes, is always one shock away from vanishing. The desert that once hid Ghana's gold now guards its secrets, a reminder that even the mightiest kingdoms can become whispers in the wind. The Abbasid Caliphate didn't just build a capital, they crafted a jewel that outshone Baghdad itself. When Caliph al-Mu'izz arrived in Egypt in 969, he didn't just conquer. He envisioned a city so magnificent it would proclaim Shia Islam's supremacy to the world. Cairo, the victorious, rose from the Nile's banks with wide boulevards, towering palaces, and the legendary Al-Azhar Mosque not just a place of worship, but the world's oldest continuously operating university. At its peak, the Fatimid court glittered with scholars debating astronomy in halls lined with lapis lazuli, while the caliph's agents smuggled revolutionary ideas across the Islamic world. This wasn't just a kingdom, it was a cultural revolution wrapped in marble and gold. What made the Fatimids extraordinary wasn't just their wealth, but their willingness to embrace diversity in an age of dogma. Unlike their Sunni rivals in Baghdad, they welcomed Jewish viziers, Christian physicians, and even Sunni scholars into their government. Their libraries held hundreds of thousands of volumes, preserving Greek philosophy and Egyptian alchemy while Europe languished in intellectual darkness. The caliphs hosted public debates where Muslims, Christians, and Jews argued theology without fear, a radical notion even by today's standards. For a fleeting moment, Cairo became the Mediterranean's true crossroads, where knowledge flowed as freely as the Nile's waters. Yet this openness sowed the seeds of their unraveling. The Fatimids' Shia beliefs centered on the divine right of the caliphs as descendants of Muhammad's daughter Fatima, alienated the Sunni majority they ruled. Their missionary network, the Dawah, secretly recruited followers from Spain to India but also bred paranoia among neighbors. By the 11th century, the Caliphate was spending more energy suppressing revolts in Palestine than governing Egypt. Then came the Crusaders, who captured Jerusalem in 1099, not just because of European zeal, but because Fatimid defenses had grown complacent. The very tolerance that made Cairo brilliant left it unprepared for an era of hardened religious lines. Enter Saladin, the Kurdish general who would become Islam's legendary unifier. When he abolished the Fatimid Caliphate in 1171, it wasn't just a political takeover, it was a theological reckoning. Sunni Islam, long sidelined in Egypt, resurged with a vengeance. Saladin turned Al-Azhar from a Shia academy into a Sunni stronghold, its minarets now calling believers back to orthodoxy. The libraries remained, but their revolutionary spirit faded beneath conservative restoration. The Fatimids' legacy is a paradox. They built a city that still thrives a millennium later, yet their religious vision vanished almost overnight. Their story reminds us that the most dazzling civilizations are often the most fragile, not because they lack strength, but because they dare to imagine a world too far ahead of its time. Today, as tourists marvel at Cairo's medieval gates and students study at Al-Azhar, few realize they're walking through the ghost of a revolution that nearly changed Islam forever. William the Conqueror didn't just win England at Hastings, he rewrote its DNA. The Domesday Book, his great census of 1086, wasn't just a tax record. It was the first time any European ruler had systematically documented every field, mill, and pigsty in his realm. Norman castles sprouted across the landscape like stone fists, crushing Saxon rebellions under their weight. French became the language of power, Latin the tongue of law, while Old English survived only in peasant hovels. Yet for all William's iron-fisted brilliance, he left his descendants an impossible inheritance, a kingdom split by the Channel, its rulers forever torn between Normandy's apple orchards and England's rainy shires. The cracks appeared almost immediately. William's son, Henry I, had to fight his own brother Robert for control of Normandy, proving that family loyalty meant nothing against territorial ambition. Then came the disaster of the White Ship in 1120, when Henry's only legitimate son drowned in a drunken maritime accident off Barfleur. What followed wasn't just a succession crisis, it was a 19-year civil war so vicious that chroniclers called it the Anarchy. Matilda, Henry's daughter, battled her cousin Stephen while barons switched sides like merchants haggling over wool prices. The lesson was clear. A cross-channel empire demanded rulers who could be in two places at once, and no mortal could manage it. By the time Henry II took the throne in 1154, the Anglo-Norman realm had ballooned into the Anjavan Empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But this sprawling dominion came with a fatal flaw. The French crown saw these territories not as independent kingdoms, but as rebellious fiefs. When Philip Augustus became King of France in 1180, he wielded feudal law like a scalpel, methodically peeling away Norman loyalty. His masterstroke came in 1204, when he declared John Lackland's continental lands forfeit for failing to answer a royal summons. The French invasion that followed wasn't just a war, it was a legalistic dismantling. One by one, Normandy's castles surrendered not to siege engines but to parchment decrees. The irony, England ultimately grew stronger by losing Normandy. Freed from continental distractions, later kings like Edward I turned their attention to unifying Britain, crafting parliament, and forging a distinctly English identity. The Norman aristocracy, once bilingual outsiders, became monolingual Englishmen, their French fading like a forgotten accent. What began as a brutal conquest ended with the conquerors assimilated, their legacy woven into law, architecture, and even the hybrid tongue we now call English. The Channel, which had always been a highway for Norman rulers, became a moat defending England's future. Sometimes empires don't fall, they evolve, shedding skins to survive in forms their founders never imagined. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon didn't just unite two crowns, it forged a weapon. In 1469, when these second cousins exchanged vows in secret, Spain was a fractured puzzle of Christian kingdoms and Muslim taifas. Within a generation, they would hammer those pieces into a single blade, its edge honed on the anvil of holy war. Their campaign to reclaim Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula, wasn't merely a military operation, it was a 10-year siege of ideology. The Alhambra's red walls, which had sheltered poets and astronomers for centuries, now faced an enemy armed with something more dangerous than catapults: absolute conviction. What set this conquest apart wasn't just its success, but its symbolism. When Boabdil, Granada's final Nasrid ruler, handed over the city's keys in 1492, the moment was staged like a divine drama. Isabella and Ferdinand entered the Alhambra beneath banners of the cross, while behind them, workers hastily converted mosques into churches. This wasn't just a transfer of power, it was the closing act of a 700-year struggle Christians called the Reconquista. Yet the real tragedy lay in what came after the victory parade. The treaty promised Granada's Muslims the mutajars, the right to practice their faith. That pledge lasted barely a decade before Cardinal Cisneros, Isabella's confessor, began burning Arabic texts in the streets and forcing conversions at spear point. The Inquisition, often imagined as a medieval relic, was in fact a ruthlessly modern machine. Established in 1478, its tribunals didn't just target Jews and Muslims, they hunted for heresy within baptized communities. Secret denunciations, extracted confessions, and public autos da fe turned neighbor against neighbor in a paranoid fever. Tomás de Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor, wasn't some frothing fanatic but a meticulous bureaucrat who kept detailed records of every trial, every confiscated property, every broken life. His innovation, making persecution profitable, the wealth seized from heretics funded Columbus's voyage the same year Granada fell, linking Spain's global expansion to its domestic purges in one grotesque irony. Isabella and Ferdinand's legacy is a paradox written in blood and gold. They created Europe's first true nation-state, complete with a standing army and centralized bureaucracy, yet their methods birthed the black legend that would haunt Spain for centuries. They expelled Jews whose financial acumen had sustained Iberian trade, then relied on Genoese bankers to fund their empire. They championed a pure Catholic identity while their own daughter, Catherine of Aragon, would be cast aside by Henry VIII for failing to bear a son, a twist that reshaped European history. Perhaps the most haunting lesson lies in Granada's silent courtyards today, where Arabic inscriptions still grace the walls beneath Christian frescoes. No victory is ever final, no conquest ever complete. The Spain Isabella and Ferdinand built didn't erase its multicultural past, it merely buried it, leaving scars that still whisper through the stones. Their story reminds us that unity bought with intolerance is a fragile thing, and that the loudest triumphs often contain the seeds of their own reckoning. The Kingdom of Aragon didn't just rule the western Mediterranean, it pirouetted across it like a dancer leaping from island to island. By the 1300s, this once modest Pyrenean realm had fingers stretching from the Balearics to Athens, its merchant ships and war galleys turning the sea into a private highway. The secret to their expansion, not just brute force, but a knack for turning marriage contracts into land deeds. When King Peter III married Constance of Sicily in 1262, he didn't just gain a queen, he got a legal claim to an entire kingdom, one his armies would later seize in a whirlwind campaign. For a time, Aragon's influence glowed brighter than Venice's, its admirals outmaneuvering Byzantines and Anjavans alike in the scramble for Mediterranean ports. But dynastic ambition came with hidden costs. Every royal wedding that added lands to Aragon's crown also diluted its focus. Like a juggler adding too many balls, the kingdom struggled to keep its scattered territories in motion. Sicily, rich in grain and strategic harbors, demanded constant attention to fend off French pretenders. Sardinia, seized in 1323, became a money pit of rebellions and pirate raids. Meanwhile, the Duchy of Athens, yes, Aragon once ruled the Acropolis, was so distant it might as well have been on the moon, governed through a fog of confused edicts and underfunded garrisons. The empire that had been built through careful marriages now groaned under the weight of its own inheritance. The cruelest twist came in 1412, when Ferdinand of Antequera traded Aragon's future for a crown. His election as King of Castile united Spain's two most powerful Christian kingdoms, but at a price. Suddenly, Aragon's resources were siphoned into Castilian wars against Granada and European intrigues. The Mediterranean, once Aragon's glittering stage, became a sideshow to Iberian politics. By the time Ferdinand and Isabella married in 1469, sealing Spain's unification, Aragon's distinctive identity was already fading like a fresco in the sun. What lingers isn't just the memory of lost territories, but the paradox of their success. Aragon's rulers proved that marriage could conquer what armies could not, yet in binding themselves to greater kingdoms, they signed their own obsolescence. Today, the Lion of Aragon still prowls the flags of Barcelona and Valencia, a reminder that the boldest expansions often leave the quietest echoes. Their story whispers a warning to every power that prizes breadth over depth. Empires built on parchment can vanish just as quickly as those forged in blood. The Kingdom of Portugal didn't just stumble upon the age of exploration, it invented it. Prince Henry the Navigator, though he rarely set foot on a ship himself, became the architect of Europe's first maritime empire. His school at Sagres wasn't a formal university but a buzzing hive of cartographers, shipwrights, and astronomers, all pushing the boundaries of what was known. Under his patronage, Portuguese caravels, those nimble, lateen-rigged vessels, slipped down the African coast like whispers on the wind, each voyage inching farther into the unknown. By 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving Africa could be circumnavigated. A decade later, Vasco da Gama reached India, tearing open a sea route that bypassed the Ottoman-controlled Silk Road. Portugal's sudden monopoly on spices didn't just fill its coffers, it rewrote global trade overnight. But the price of being first was exhaustion. Every outpost from Goa to Macau demanded garrisons, administrators, and constant defense against jealous rivals. The Portuguese crown, dizzy with success, overplayed its hand. In 1578, young King Sebastian led a crusade into Morocco, only to vanish at the Battle of Alcácer alongside most of his nobility. The disaster left the throne to his elderly uncle, Cardinal Henry, whose death 2 years later plunged Portugal into a succession crisis. Spain's Habsburgs swooped in, absorbing the kingdom for 60 years, a humiliation that sapped Portugal's independence just as Dutch and English ships began chipping away at its empire. The cruelest irony, Portugal's greatest strength, its relentless innovation, became its Achilles heel. While others copied their ship designs and navigational techniques, the Portuguese clung to outdated monopolies. Their Estado da India, a sprawling network of forts and factories, grew bloated and corrupt. By the time Brazil's gold mines offered a second wind in the 1700s, Portugal was a shadow of its former self, its once cutting-edge caravels now outclassed by European rivals. What lingers isn't just the memory of faded glory, but the lesson etched into Lisbon's Manuline architecture. Empires built on daring must keep daring, or watch the tides erase their footprints. Portugal's legacy isn't in the spices it hoarded, but in the horizons it taught the world to see. The Kingdom of France didn't just survive the Middle Ages, it reinvented what a nation could be. Philip Augustus, the cunning ruler who came to power in 1180, didn't win battles with brute force alone. His genius lay in paperwork and patience. While Richard the Lionheart crusaded and schemed, Philip quietly expanded royal domains, replacing rebellious barons with loyal bureaucrats. His creation of the Baileys regional administrators, who answered only to the crown, wasn't glamorous, but it transformed France from a loose collection of fiefs into something resembling a modern state. Paris, once a muddy island in the Seine, grew fortified walls and a central market, its streets patrolled by the first professional city guards in Europe. The Louvre, originally built as a fortress to guard against Viking raids, now stored royal archives alongside swords. Then came Louis IX, the saintly king who turned piety into power. His reputation for fairness drew peasants to his court like pilgrims to a shrine, bypassing feudal lords altogether. When he sat beneath an oak tree to personally hear grievances, he wasn't just performing charity, he was eroding noble authority one judgment at a time. His silver coins, the gros tournois, circulated from Flanders to Jerusalem, carrying his likeness farther than any French army had marched. But Louis' greatest legacy was invisible, the idea that the king wasn't just another warlord, but the embodiment of justice itself. This hard-won centralization nearly shattered during the 100 Years' War, when English longbows cut down French knights at Crécy in 1346. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a crisis of legitimacy. The Valois kings, struggling to pay ransoms and mercenaries, resorted to debasing currency and raising taxes, sparking peasant revolts like the Jacquerie. Paris itself fell to rioters in 1358, its streets running red as mobs slaughtered nobles. At one point, England controlled more French territory than the French crown, with Henry V of England even declared heir to the throne. What saved France wasn't just Joan of Arc's theatrics at Orleans, it was the bureaucratic machinery Philip and Louis had built generations earlier. Even with half the country occupied, royal tax collectors still operated, and the Parlement of Paris continued issuing rulings. By the time Charles VII expelled the English in 1453, the war had accidentally strengthened the monarchy. Desperate for funds, kings had permanently established national taxes like the taille, bypassing feudal assemblies altogether. The very crisis that nearly destroyed France ultimately forged it into Europe's first true nation-state, proof that sometimes survival isn't about avoiding disaster, but learning how to rebuild stronger from the wreckage. The Kingdom of England's crown was less a symbol of power than a lightning rod for chaos. When King John reluctantly set his seal to the Magna Carta in 1215, he wasn't just signing a document, he was acknowledging that even monarchs had limits. The barons who forced his hand weren't revolutionaries dreaming of democracy, they were feudal lords protecting their privileges. Yet this fragile parchment, drafted in a riverside meadow at Runnymede, became the seed of constitutional government. The irony, John died just months later, dysentery claiming the king who'd been drowning in crises of his own making, lost wars, excommunications, and a treasury so empty his corpse was reportedly buried in borrowed robes. England's next century was a seesaw between weak kings and overmighty barons. Henry III, crowned at just 9 years old, spent his reign drowning in debt and humiliation. His attempt to install French favorites at court sparked a civil war that saw rebel leader Simon de Montfort summoning the first parliament including commoners in 1265, an accident of politics that would echo through history. Then came Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, who conquered Wales but spent his final years chasing William Wallace through the Highlands, his war chest drained and his body failing. The kingdom he left behind was larger but financially gutted, a pattern that would repeat for generations. The Black Death of 1348 didn't just kill people, it shattered feudalism's foundations. With half the population dead, surviving peasants suddenly had leverage. When King Richard II tried to freeze wages with the Statute of Labourers, it sparked the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Rebels stormed London, beheading the Archbishop of Canterbury and forcing the 14-year-old king to negotiate face-to-face on Mile End Road. Richard's promises of reform were lies. He had the rebel leaders hanged within weeks, but the genie couldn't be forced back into the bottle. The old order was cracking. Then came the dynastic storm called the Wars of the Roses. What began in 1455 as a squabble between rival branches of the Plantagenet family, Lancaster's Red Rose versus York's White, descended into 30 years of butchery. Kings were made and unmade with bewildering speed. Henry VI captured and recaptured, Edward IV fleeing to Burgundy only to return victorious, Richard III allegedly ordering his nephew's murder in the Tower. The conflict's brutality was matched only by its pointlessness by the time Henry Tudor defeated Richard at Bosworth Field in 1485. So many noble lines had been extinguished that the victor could barely scrape together enough lords to form a parliament. What makes England's medieval turbulence so fascinating isn't the chaos itself, but what emerged from it. Each crisis, Magna Carta, de Montfort's Parliament, the Peasants' Revolt, accidentally nudged power away from the crown. By the time Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring factions, he ruled a land where kings could no longer simply command obedience. The medieval monarchy's greatest legacy wasn't its glory, but its failures proof that even the mightiest thrones must answer to something greater than themselves. The Kingdom of Scotland's story isn't just about battles, it's about survival against a neighbor that refused to take no for an answer. When Edward I of England, known as Longshanks for his towering height, marched north in 1296, he didn't just bring an army, he brought a sledgehammer to smash Scottish resistance. His troops carried the Stone of Destiny, Scotland's ancient coronation stone, back to Westminster as a trophy, symbolically stripping the Scots of their very identity. But Edward underestimated the fury he'd unleashed. In the shadows of the Highlands, a guerrilla war was brewing, led by a minor noble named William Wallace. His victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297 wasn't just a military upset. It was a declaration that Scotland's spirit couldn't be broken, even if its armies were outnumbered and outgunned. Wallace's campaign was as short as it was brilliant. Within a year, English forces regrouped and crushed his army at Falkirk, forcing him into hiding before his brutal execution in 1305. Yet his legacy wasn't in the battles he won, but in the fire he lit. Robert the Bruce, a nobleman with a shaky claim to Scotland's throne, watched Wallace's fate and learned. Where Wallace had been reckless, Bruce was calculating. He didn't just want to fight England, he wanted to outlast them. Crowned king in 1306, Bruce spent years waging a war of attrition, avoiding pitched battles and striking when English supply lines stretched thin. His masterstroke came at Bannockburn in 1314, where his smaller force used the boggy terrain to trap Edward II's cavalry, turning the tide of the war. The Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, a letter to the Pope signed by Scottish nobles, articulated something radical for its time, that a king's authority came from the people, not divine right. This wasn't just politics, it was philosophy weaponized. The Pope recognized Scottish independence, and for nearly 4 centuries, Scotland stood apart. But sovereignty is fragile when your neighbor controls the trade routes. By the 1600s, Scotland's economy was buckling under English embargoes and failed colonial ventures like the disastrous Darien scheme in Panama, which bankrupted countless nobles. When Queen Anne ascended the English throne in 1702, the stage was set for an offer Scotland couldn't refuse: union or ruin. The Act of Union in 1707 didn't just merge parliaments, it erased a kingdom. Overnight, Scotland's independent legislature vanished, replaced by seats in Westminster. Some called it a sellout, others a pragmatic reset. The Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, were less about restoring the Stuarts than reclaiming a lost autonomy. Their crushing defeat at Culloden in 1746 didn't just end a rebellion, it shattered the Highland way of life, with clan systems banned and tartan outlawed. Yet Scotland's story doesn't end in surrender. The very union meant to erase its identity became a platform for its revival. Scottish intellectuals like Adam Smith and David Hume shaped the Enlightenment, while engineers like James Watt powered the Industrial Revolution. Today, Edinburgh's Parliament stands again, a testament to a kingdom that refused to disappear. The lesson isn't just in how nations fall, but in how they endure, not always as sovereign states, but as stubborn, unkillable ideas. The Kingdom of Hungary under Matthias Corvinus wasn't just a medieval holdout, it was a Renaissance powerhouse masquerading as a fortress on the Danube. When Matthias took the throne in 1458, he inherited a realm squeezed between Habsburg ambitions and Ottoman expansion. But this king, a patron of art and learning who kept a library second only to the Vatican's, refused to play the doomed defender. Instead, he built the Black Army, Europe's first professional standing force since Roman times. These weren't feudal levies but disciplined mercenaries paid from royal coffers, their loyalty bought with gold instead of land. With them, Matthias didn't just defend Hungary, he expanded it, snatching Vienna from the Habsburgs in 1485 and turning Buda into a glittering capital where Italian humanists debated under frescoed ceilings. For a moment, it seemed Hungary might outpace its rivals not through brute force but by outthinking them. Then came the cracks no brilliance could seal. Matthias died without a legitimate heir in 1490, leaving the throne to a weak-willed nobleman more interested in hunting than statecraft. The Black Army, unpaid and restless, dissolved into marauding bands. Hungary's treasury, drained by Matthias's cultural splendor and military campaigns, couldn't replenish its defenses. Meanwhile, the Ottomans weren't just knocking at the door, they were building a battering ram. Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of an empire stretching from Algiers to Baghdad, saw Hungary not as a kingdom to conquer, but as a highway to Vienna. Mohawks in 1526 wasn't just a battle, it was a massacre dressed as a showdown. King Louis II, 20 years old and desperate to prove himself, rushed his outnumbered knights into a muddy killing field. Ottoman cannons and Janissary muskets turned the Danube's floodplain into a slaughterhouse. By afternoon, 10,000 Hungarians lay dead, including most of the nobility and the king himself, whose body wasn't found for weeks. The Ottomans didn't just win, they erased Hungary's leadership in a single afternoon. What followed was a dismemberment. The Habsburgs grabbed the Western Third, Transylvanian nobles carved out a precarious autonomy, and the Ottomans occupied the heartland, including Buda's ruined palaces. The kingdom that had once rivaled Renaissance Italy became a fractured battleground for 3 centuries. The tragedy isn't just in the fall, but in the timing. Matthias had shown Hungary could thrive as a bridge between East and West, only for his successors to prove how quickly bridges can burn. Today, when tourists admire Corvinus's library or stroll the rebuilt streets of Buda, they're walking through the ghost of what might have been a kingdom that glimpsed greatness, only to be crushed between empires it couldn't outlast. The Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania didn't just reject absolute monarchy, it built a political experiment so radical it would make modern democracies blush. Imagine a 16th century realm where the nobility, nearly 10% of the population, could veto laws in parliament, elect their kings, and even legally rebel if rulers overstepped. This wasn't chaos, it was a deliberate system called the Golden Liberty, where checks on power were woven into the fabric of government. At its peak, the Commonwealth spanned from the Baltic to the Black Sea, its borders swallowing what are now 6 modern nations. Warsaw's royal elections drew contenders from across Europe, with nobles gathering in fields like a colossal open-air democracy, their votes swayed by promises of tax cuts and foreign alliances. For a fleeting moment, it seemed this decentralized giant might redefine what a European state could be. But liberty, when taken too far, becomes a slow-acting poison. The king wasn't just weak, he was handcuffed by the liberum veto, a rule allowing any single noble to derail legislation by shouting, "I object." What began as a safeguard against tyranny devolved into paralysis. Foreign powers like Russia and Prussia soon realized they didn't need armies to control Poland, just bribes. A well-paid noble could single-handedly sabotage reforms, leaving the Commonwealth unable to raise taxes, modernize its military, or even defend its borders. By the 1700s, while neighbors like Prussia built bureaucracies and standing armies, Poland-Lithuania's parliament became a theater of dysfunction, with sessions dissolving in fistfights or collapsing under the weight of endless debates. The final unraveling was as methodical as it was humiliating. Between 1772 and 1795, 3 partitions saw Poland-Lithuania carved up like a feast for hungry empires. Russia, Prussia, and Austria didn't just conquer territory, they erased a kingdom from the map, its name stricken from official documents for over a century. The last king, Stanislaw August Poniatowski, was a patron of the arts who championed Enlightenment ideals but proved powerless against the tide. His abdication in 1795 wasn't just a personal defeat, it was the death certificate of a state that had prized freedom over survival. What lingers isn't just the tragedy, but the paradox. Poland-Lithuania's system nurtured thinkers like Copernicus and composers like Chopin. Its Jewish communities thrived under relative tolerance, and its constitution of May 3, 1791, was Europe's first modern codified national charter. Yet these flashes of brilliance couldn't compensate for a fatal flaw. A system that mistrusted authority so deeply it forgot cohesion is the price of sovereignty. The lesson echoes wherever democracies balance liberty against strength, a reminder that the loudest voices aren't always the wisest, and that even the noblest ideals can collapse under their own weight. The Kivan Rus began as a Viking's fever dream, a realm stitched together by Norse adventurers who saw not just rivers to raid, but highways to empire. Picture the 9th century Dnieper River where Swedish traders turned, conquerors like Rurik and Oleg portaged their longships between Baltic and Black Sea, weaving Scandinavian muscle with Slavic might. Kiev, their glittering capital, became a crossroads where Byzantine silks met Frankish swords, where Orthodox Christianity took root beneath domes gilded with loot from Constantinople. At its height under rulers like Vladimir the Great and Yaroslav the Wise, this was no backwater. It was a sprawling network of city-states bound by trade, faith, and the sword, its princes intermarrying with European royalty while its merchants traded amber for Arab silver. Yet the Rus carried a fatal flaw in its very design. Instead of centralized rule, it relied on a rotating system of succession where princes moved between cities like pieces on a chessboard. Kiev today, Novgorod tomorrow. What began as a way to share power became a recipe for civil war, as rival branches of the Rurikid dynasty turned on each other with brutal enthusiasm. By the 1200s, the once mighty realm had fractured into squabbling principalities, their militias more focused on raiding each other than facing external threats. They never saw the storm gathering in the east. When the Mongols arrived in 1237, they didn't just defeat the Rus, they dismantled it with surgical precision. The Battle of the Kalka River in 1223 had been a warning, but the princes ignored it, too busy feuding to unite. 2 decades later, Batu Khan's horsemen returned, burning Kiev so thoroughly that a papal envoy reported finding only skulls and bones of the dead, where Europe's largest city once stood. The Mongols imposed a cruel genius of governance. They let the Rus keep their princes and faith, but demanded absolute obedience and staggering tribute. Silver flowed east while spies called Baskaks watched for rebellion from horseback. From this humiliation, 2 paths diverged. In the northeast, the princes of Moscow turned submission into strategy. They became the Mongols' tax collectors, amassing wealth and influence by squeezing their neighbors on the Khan's behalf. Ivan I, nicknamed Moneybag, used this dirty wealth to buy titles and land, positioning Moscow as the Rus' inevitable heart. Meanwhile, in the northwest, Novgorod thrived by ignoring the chaos. Its birchbark letters reveal a bustling republic where women owned property and merchants voted in assemblies, all protected by swampy forests the Mongols couldn't penetrate. The irony, the Mongols, by breaking Kiev's power, created the vacuum that let Moscow rise. When the Golden Horde fragmented in the 1400s, it was the princes of Moscow who cast off the Tatar yoke, not with reckless rebellion, but by patiently waiting for their moment. Their victory at Kulikovo Field in 1380 was less a military turning point than a psychological one, proof that the Mongols weren't invincible. By the time Ivan III declared himself Tsar of all Rus in 1472, he was reviving a title last used by Kiev's rulers, but building something entirely new, an autocratic state where the church anointed absolute power and where the ghost of Mongol rule lived on in brutal governance styles. The Kivan Rus legacy isn't just in the icons of Novgorod or the onion domes of Moscow, but in the paradox it bequeathed to Russia, a land forever torn between European aspirations and Asiatic methods of control. Its story whispers that empires aren't always destroyed by outsiders. Sometimes they fracture from within, leaving pieces for sharper hands to reassemble. Stefan Dushan didn't just wear a crown, he forged an empire with the ambition of a man who believed he could outshine Byzantium itself. By 1346, this Serbian king had declared himself Emperor of the Serbs and Greeks, his realm stretching from the Danube to the Aegean, its laws codified in the monumental Dushan's Code. This wasn't just a legal document, it was a manifesto, blending Byzantine bureaucracy with Slavic tradition to create a state where merchants could travel safely from Dubrovnik to Thessaloniki under Serbian protection. His capital at Skopje buzzed with diplomats from Venice and Bulgaria, while Orthodox monasteries like Visoki Dečani rose like marble fortresses, their frescoes proclaiming Serbia's divine right to rule. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the Balkans might have a new Rome, but empires built too fast often crumble faster. Dušan's sudden death in 1355 left his realm to his teenage son, Joroš the Weak, a ruler whose name would become a cruel epitaph. Serbian nobles, once held in check by Dušan's iron will, now carved the empire into rival fiefdoms. The Ottomans, already crossing into Europe, didn't even need to conquer Serbia, they watched it tear itself apart. By 1371, the last pitiful fragments of Dušan's empire became vassals to the Turkish Sultan, their independence traded for survival. Then came Kosovo in 1389, a battle that transcended warfare to become myth. Prince Lazar, leading a coalition of Serbian nobles, faced the Ottoman Sultan Murad's army on the Field of Blackbirds. The details blur between history and legend. Lazar's alleged choice between a heavenly or earthly kingdom, the Serbian knight Miloš Obilić sneaking into Murad's tent to assassinate him, the blood-soaked ground where both leaders perished. What's undeniable is the outcome. Serbia's defeat was so total that it became a cultural crucifixion, a moment seared into national identity. Yet Kosovo's true legacy isn't in the loss, but in how Serbia refused to let it be the end. Even under Ottoman rule, the Serbian Orthodox Church preserved Dušan's legacy, turning Lazar into a martyr saint and Kosovo into a sacred wound. The empire was gone, but the idea of Serbia endured, whispering through folk songs and clandestine monasteries. Today, when visitors stand before the towering frescoes of Gračanica or hear the epic poetry of Kosovo's heroes, they're witnessing something rarer than military victory, the unbreakable grip of memory. Dušan's lesson is stark. Greatness means nothing without unity, but even the darkest defeats can't erase a people's will to remember who they were. The Kingdom of Bulgaria under Simon I didn't just challenge Byzantium, it rewrote the rules of Balkan power. Picture a 9th century world where Constantinople's walls seemed unbreakable, its emperors secure behind layers of diplomacy and Greek fire. Then came Simon, a ruler raised in the Byzantine court itself, fluent in their language but burning with ambition to surpass his tutors. By 913, he wasn't just raiding imperial territory, he was dictating terms outside the Theodosian walls, forcing the child Emperor Constantine VII to bow to him as Emperor of the Bulgarians, a title no barbarian king had ever claimed. His capital at Preslav glittered with stolen Byzantine mosaics, its scholars translating Greek classics into Old Church Slavonic, creating a literary tradition that would outlast empires. For 34 years, he waged a war of nerves and sieges, coming closer than any Slav before or since to seizing the ultimate prize, the throne of the Caesars. Yet brilliance in battle doesn't always translate to lasting triumph. Simon's fatal flaw wasn't lack of vision, it was excess. Each victory stretched Bulgarian resources thinner, like gold leaf pulled over too much surface. His siege of Constantinople in 923 showcased both his audacity and his limits. Without a navy to blockade the city, his armies could only camp outside the land walls while Byzantine ships kept the capital fed. The Patriarch reportedly paraded the Virgin's robe along the ramparts, rallying defenders who believed the relic alone turned back the invaders. In truth, it was logistics, not miracles, that saved Byzantium. Simon, for all his tactical genius, lacked the infrastructure to sustain prolonged campaigns far from home. The deeper tragedy lay in what followed his death in 927. His son Peter inherited an exhausted kingdom, its boyars restless from decades of war. Byzantium, ever the patient predator, offered a poisoned gift, a royal marriage to Emperor Constantine's granddaughter, cementing peace but tying Bulgaria into a web of imperial influence. Prislav's scholars kept writing, but its armies grew soft. By the 1000s, Basil II, later nicknamed the Bulgar Slayer, would exploit this complacency with methodical cruelty, blinding 15,000 captured soldiers after the Battle of Claudion in 1014 and sending them home as a grotesque warning. Simon's legacy is a masterclass in the paradox of overreach. His campaigns proved a barbarian kingdom could outthink Byzantium in open battle, yet his failure to consolidate gains left Bulgaria vulnerable to the very empire he'd humiliated. The lesson whispers through history: ambition without sustainability is just a prelude to decline. Today, when visitors see the golden masks of Prislav's nobles in Sofia's museums or trace the Cyrillic script he championed, they're witnessing not just a fallen kingdom's glory, but the fragile line between greatness and overextension, a line Simon danced upon until the weight of his own dreams pulled him down. The Kingdom of Norway didn't just hug its coastline, it rode the waves like a chariot, turning the North Sea into its personal highway. It all began with Harald Fairhair, the fiery-haired warlord who, according to sagas, vowed not to cut or comb his hair until he'd unified Norway's fractious fjord kingdoms. His victory at Hafrsfjord around the year 872 wasn't just a battle, it was the birth of a maritime empire. Viking longships, those slender dragons of oak and iron, became Norway's lifelines, carrying settlers to Iceland, explorers to Greenland, and even a lost band of adventurers to the foggy shores of North America centuries before Columbus. This wasn't just a kingdom, it was a network of ports and alliances strung together by saltwater and audacity. But sea power is a fickle friend. By the 1300s, Norway's golden age was ebbing. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it hollowed out entire trading towns, leaving Bergen's wharves silent and Oslo's warehouses empty. Meanwhile, Danish kings eyed Norway's strategic harbors like wolves circling wounded prey. The Kalmar Union of 1397, which bound Norway, Denmark, and Sweden under a single crown, was sold as a partnership of equals. In reality, it was a slow-motion annexation. Copenhagen's bureaucrats replaced Norwegian laws with Danish edicts, herring taxes flowed south, and even the kingdom's iconic stave churches began sporting Danish architectural flourishes. Norway's ships still sailed, but now they flew foreign flags. The cruelest twist, Norway's own nobility aided their kingdom's erasure. Starved for trade and desperate to maintain privileges, local elites married into Danish families, adopted Danish customs, and quietly let their language fade into a peasant dialect. By the time Sweden broke free of the Union in 1523, Norway lacked the institutions or will to follow. It became Denmark's forgotten province, its once proud fleet reduced to a fishing auxiliary. Yet the sea never forgot its people. When Norway finally regained independence in 1814 after centuries of Danish rule, it was fishermen and merchants who kept the old identity alive, not kings or castles. Today, as oil rigs dot the North Sea where Viking longships once raced, Norway's story whispers an eternal truth. Kingdoms built on water may be conquered, but their spirit always rises with the tide. The Kingdom of Sweden's rise to Baltic supremacy wasn't just a matter of conquest, it was a masterclass in military revolution. Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, didn't merely lead armies, he reinvented warfare itself. In the early 1600s, while Europe's battles still lumbered with pike squares and cumbersome muskets, Gustavus streamlined his forces into lethal flexibility. His infantry moved in smaller, faster units, supported by light artillery that could be repositioned mid-battle like chess pieces. Cavalry didn't just charge, they struck with disciplined precision, wheeling on command to exploit gaps in enemy lines. This wasn't just innovation, it was a blueprint for modern warfare, tested triumphantly at Breitenfeld in 1631, where his outnumbered Swedes crushed the Holy Roman Empire's forces. But Gustavus's genius extended beyond the battlefield. He understood that wars were won as much by logistics as by bravery. Sweden's iron mines bankrolled his campaigns, while a network of supply depots ensured his troops never starved. His alliance with France turned Protestant resistance into a pan-European conflict, stretching Habsburg resources thin. When he fell at Lutzen in 1632, leading a cavalry charge in the fog, he left behind more than a grieving nation. He'd transformed Sweden from a frozen backwater into the arbiter of Northern Europe, its influence stretching from the Rhine to the Neva. The empire Gustavus built seemed unshakable for decades. His daughter Christina, though eccentric, presided over a glittering court where Descartes tutored her in philosophy. Charles X expanded Sweden's territories, and by the late 1600s, the Baltic had become essentially a Swedish lake, guarded by fortresses like Riga and Tallinn. But empires grown too fast often forget the cost of upkeep. Sweden's dominance relied on constant war taxes, resentful occupied territories, and the fragile assumption that rivals like Russia and Denmark would never coordinate. Then came the reckoning, the Great Northern War in 1700. Charles XII, inheriting the throne at 15, seemed Gustavus reborn, a fearless tactician who crushed Russian armies at Narva with just 8,000 men against 40,000. But audacity curdles into recklessness without strategy. Instead of finishing off Peter the Great's crippled forces, Charles turned south to pursue the Polish crown, giving Russia time to rebuild. Peter used those precious years to modernize his army, adopting Swedish tactics while developing new weapons factories. When Charles finally marched on Moscow in 1708, he met a transformed enemy and the merciless Russian winter. Poltava in 1709 wasn't just a defeat, it was annihilation. Charles, wounded and unable to command effectively, watched his exhausted troops break against Russian redoubts. The survivors surrendered en masse, and the king fled to Ottoman exile. Sweden's Baltic provinces fell like dominoes: Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, each loss shrinking the empire Gustavus had built. Charles returned years later, only to die obscurely besieging a Norwegian fortress in 1718. The peace treaties that followed didn't just strip territory, they erased Sweden's great power status forever. What makes this fall so poignant is its inevitability. Sweden had punched far above its weight for a century, sustained by brilliant kings and geographic luck. But no kingdom, no matter how innovative, can forever resist the gravitational pull of larger neighbors. The legacy isn't just in the lost battles, but in the paradox they reveal. Sometimes, the very qualities that build an empire, boldness, adaptability, relentless ambition, become the flaws that destroy it. Today, Stockholm's Vasa Museum preserves a different kind of lesson. The wreck of a top-heavy warship that sank on its maiden voyage. It's a fitting metaphor for Sweden's Baltic dominance. Magnificent, advanced, but ultimately unable to bear its own grandeur. The Kingdom of Denmark's claws once sank deep into England's soil, not as invaders but as rulers. In the late 9th century, the Danelaw wasn't just a conquered territory. It was a parallel kingdom where Danish customs held sway from Northumbria to East Anglia. Viking jarls dispensed justice at thing sites under open skies, their laws carved in runes rather than Latin. York became Jorvik, a bustling hub where Arab silver coins jingled in market stalls alongside Saxon brooches. For generations, Danish kings like Sweyn Forkbeard didn't just raid England, they claimed its throne, forcing Ethelred the Unready into humiliating exile. The very word England temporarily vanished from charters, replaced by Sea Kingdom of the Danes. Yet power built on longships and battle axes rarely outlasts the men who wield them. The Danelaw's decline wasn't marked by a single catastrophic defeat, but by a slow bleeding of influence. Saxon kings like Alfred's descendants chipped away at Danish territory, not through brute force alone, but by offering a subtler bargain: assimilation. Danish settlers, tired of eternal warfare, began adopting Saxon Christianity and intermarrying with local families. By the time Cnut the Great ruled a North Sea empire in the 11th century, his court spoke Old English as often as Old Norse. The irony: Denmark's greatest king spent more energy holding England than his ancestral homeland, leaving his Scandinavian domains neglected. The final unraveling came not from Saxon resistance, but from Denmark's own overextension. When Edward the Confessor died childless in 1066, the Danish claim to England fell to Harald Hardrada, a legendary Viking, but no match for the Norman knights at Stamford Bridge. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings didn't just end Saxon rule. It slammed the door on Scandinavia's English ambitions for good. Denmark, once the terror of Europe's coasts, now found itself outpaced by feudal states with castles, bureaucracies, and crossbow militias. What makes Denmark's arc so compelling isn't the loss itself, but how it transformed the kingdom. Forced to look inward, Danish kings turned their attention to the Baltic, building the formidable Kalmar Union with Norway and Sweden. Their Viking heritage didn't vanish, it evolved. The very ships that once carried raiders now transported fish and timber, fueling the Hanseatic League's trade networks. Today, when visitors stand in Jelling before Harald Bluetooth's runestone, the birth certificate of Denmark, they're seeing more than a monument to conquest. They're witnessing a kingdom that learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes, letting go of an empire is the only way to save a nation. The Kingdom of Bohemia's story isn't just about kings and crowns. It's about a preacher whose words lit a fire that nearly burned down medieval Europe. Jan Hus, a humble scholar at Prague's Charles University, didn't set out to start a revolution. All he wanted was to bring the church back to what he saw as its humble roots: no indulgences, no papal corruption, just the pure word of God. But when he stood before the Council of Constance in 1415, expecting debate and instead receiving a death sentence, his execution pyre became the spark for something far bigger. Hus's last words, "You may roast this goose, but a swan will come after me," weren't just defiance. They were prophecy. Out of the ashes rose the Hussites, a movement that turned Bohemia into Europe's first Protestant stronghold a full century before Luther. These weren't just religious reformers, they were innovators of total war. When Emperor Sigismund sent crusade after crusade to crush them, the Hussites responded with armored wagons chained together into mobile fortresses, priests leading charges with maces instead of crosses, and battle hymns so stirring they'd later inspire Lutheran chorales. Their leader, the one-eyed General Jan Žižka, pioneered tactics that would echo for centuries, using terrain, psychological warfare, and the sheer fervor of people fighting for their faith. At the Battle of Vitkov Hill in 1420, his ragtag farmers and artisans held off a professional army 10 times their size, proving ideas could be deadlier than swords. Yet zeal comes at a cost. The Hussite movement fractured almost as fast as it had united. Moderates who wanted compromise with Rome clashed with radicals who believed Christ's return was imminent. Towns that had stood together against Crusaders now turned on each other, with the infamous siege of Tabor revealing how quickly revolutionary purity curdles into infighting. By 1434, exhaustion forced a truce, the Basel Compromise, that granted Bohemia limited religious freedoms but left it isolated, a heretic kingdom in a Catholic continent. Enter the Habsburgs. Like patient spiders, they wove their web around Bohemia through marriages and treaties until Verdun and the First claimed the throne in 1526. His grandson Rudolf II, ruling from Prague's glittering castle, seemed an unlikely oppressor, an art-loving recluse who entertained astronomers like Kepler and alchemists in his court. But when Protestant nobles rebelled in 1618, throwing Habsburg governors out windows in the defenestration of Prague, the empire struck back with terrifying efficiency. The Battle of White Mountain wasn't just a defeat, it was a cultural extermination. Protestant leaders were executed, their lands handed to loyal Catholics, and Bohemia's distinct identity was systematically erased under Germanization. What makes this rise and fall so haunting is how close Huss's dream came to reshaping Europe. For a brief moment, Bohemia proved a kingdom could defy pope and emperor alike. Yet in the end, the Habsburgs didn't just conquer Bohemia, they absorbed it, turning rebellion into a cautionary tale. Today, when visitors walk Prague's Charles Bridge at dawn, they're standing atop history's irony. A city that once roared with reform, now preserved as a museum of what might have been. The lesson isn't just about faith or politics, it's about how easily the flame of revolution can be smothered, not by force alone, but by the slow, patient weight of empire. The Kingdom of Burgundy didn't just fade from history, it was dismantled piece by piece, its very memory scattered like leaves in a storm. Picture the early 15th century, when the Valois dukes of Burgundy ruled lands richer than the kings of France themselves. Their court in Dijon glittered with tapestries woven from gold thread. Their libraries held illuminated manuscripts that rivaled the Vatican's, and their territories stretched from the icy canals of Flanders to the sun-drenched vineyards of Provence. This wasn't just a kingdom, it was a cultural superpower where Flemish painters and French poets mingled under the patronage of rulers like Philip the Bold and Charles the Rash. For a moment, it seemed Burgundy might eclipse France entirely, forging a new European heartland between Paris and the Alps. Then came the miscalculation that would unravel everything. Charles the Rash, perhaps the most tragically misnamed ruler in history, spent his reign chasing glory like a man trying to grasp smoke. His fatal flaw wasn't lack of ambition, it was too much. He wanted a crown so badly that he fought the Swiss Confederacy in the dead of winter at Morat in 1476, ignoring the lessons of history. Swiss pikemen, hardened by mountain winters, butchered his vaunted Burgundian knights in the snow. 3 years later, at the Battle of Nancy, Charles finally got his crown, ironically, not in life but in death. His frozen corpse was found half-eaten by wolves, the ducal coronet still perched on his skull. The aftermath was less a conquest than a feeding frenzy. France's Louis XI, nicknamed the Universal Spider for his web of intrigues, didn't even need to fight for Burgundy's core lands. He simply married his son to Charles's heir, Mary. When she died young in a hunting accident, the French crown pounced, annexing Burgundy proper, while the Habsburgs snatched the wealthy Low Countries through Mary's widower. Within a generation, the duchy that had once minted its own currency and fielded armies to rival empires was reduced to a mere geographical term, its identity dissolved between stronger neighbors. What makes Burgundy's disappearance so haunting isn't the military defeat, but the cultural erasure. The dukes had nurtured a distinct Burgundian identity, neither fully French nor Flemish, but something in between. Their ceremonial order of the Golden Fleece became a Habsburg heirloom. Their brilliant court music faded into obscurity, and even their famed vineyards were rebranded as French terroir. Today, tourists sipping Pinot Noir in Beaune or admiring Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece rarely realize they're touching fragments of a vanished realm. The lesson isn't just about the fragility of power, it's about how history discards even the grandest dreams when they lack institutions to outlive their founders. Burgundy's art survives, its wine still flows, but the kingdom itself is a ghost, whispering that not all who shine brightly leave shadows. Some vanish completely, leaving only the faintest imprint on the world they once sought to rule. The Kingdom of Sicily under the Normans wasn't just a kingdom, it was a living experiment in cultural alchemy. Picture Palermo in the 12th century, where Latin church bells mingled with the muezzins' call to prayer, where Greek-speaking bureaucrats kept tax records in Arabic script, and where Jewish merchants brokered deals between Viking mercenaries and Byzantine silk traders. Roger II, crowned in 1130, didn't merely tolerate this diversity, he weaponized it. His royal mantle, embroidered with golden lions and Arabic blessings, symbolized a realm where Christian knights, Muslim scientists, and Greek artists collaborated under one crown. The Palatine Chapel, with its glittering Byzantine mosaics and honeycombed Arab ceilings, stood as a physical manifesto. Here, the Mediterranean's fractured civilizations could weave themselves into something greater. Yet this brilliance came with fragile foundations. Sicily's strength, its ability to synthesize, became its weakness when faced with enemies who saw the world in absolutes. The Normans, for all their adaptability, were still outsiders ruling a restive population. Arab revolts in the 1140s and Greek uprisings in the 1160s forced Roger's successors to choose between tolerance and control. By the time Frederick II, the Stupa Mundi, inherited the throne in 1198, the kingdom's finances were already bleeding from endless campaigns to prop up his German ambitions. His court in Palermo might have hosted falconry treatises and astronomical debates, but the treasury was being emptied to fight Lombard rebels and papal armies. The fatal twist, Sicily's very richness made it a prize others coveted. When Charles of Anjou seized the throne in 1266, he didn't inherit a kingdom, he took a looted chest. The Anjavans, crude and pious, saw Sicily's multiculturalism as heresy to be purged. Arab administrators were dismissed, Greek monasteries suppressed, and Jewish quarters walled off. The Vespers Rebellion of 1282 wasn't just a revolt against French rule, it was the death scream of Roger's vision. By inviting Peter of Aragon to replace Charles, the Sicilians traded one foreign master for another, but the damage was done. The delicate balance of languages and faiths shattered like a dropped mosaic. What lingers isn't just the memory of lost harmony, but the warning etched into Sicily's stones. Diversity alone can't sustain a kingdom against the hunger of empires. The Normans proved that a society could thrive by borrowing from everyone, but without the strength to defend that openness, it becomes a museum, not a living thing. Today, when travelers admire the Arab-Norman arches of Palermo's churches or decipher Frederick's multilingual decrees, they're touching the ghost of a dream. That difference need not divide, but only if the hands that weave the tapestry are strong enough to hold it together. The Teutonic Order didn't just wage holy war, they built a theocracy with brick, blood, and bureaucratic precision. Picture the Baltic coast in the 13th century, a land of tangled forests and pagan tribes where winter winds howled like wolves. Into this wilderness rode knights clad in white mantles emblazoned with black crosses, their swords blessed by popes and their ledgers filled with meticulous records. These weren't mere soldiers, they were CEO monks, running a state that blended monastic discipline with military efficiency. Their conquest of Prussia wasn't a chaotic rampage but a systematic colonization, forests cleared, towns charted, and dissenters burned at stakes that doubled as boundary markers. By the 1400s, their Ordensstadt boasted fortified castles like Malbork, a sprawling red brick headquarters so vast it could garrison 3,000 troops and store enough grain to survive a decade-long siege. Yet the very zeal that fueled their rise became their undoing. The Teutonic Knights, convinced God favored their cause, failed to notice the world shifting around them. Their once justified crusade against pagan Lithuanians collapsed when Lithuania converted to Christianity in 1387, leaving the order without a divine mandate. Worse, their brutal tactics, massacres, forced conversions, and heavy taxes turned neighboring rulers into enemies. Poland and Lithuania, historically at odds, found common cause against these armored fanatics. The Battle of Grunwald in 1410 wasn't just a defeat, it was a carnage so thorough it entered legend. Some 50,000 men clashed in a muddy field, with Polish-Lithuanian forces using feigned retreats to lure the overconfident knights into a slaughter. The Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, died clutching a broken lance, his body stripped of armor and left for crows. The irony: the Teutonic state survived Grunwald but lost its soul. To pay crippling reparations, the knights taxed their subjects into poverty, sparking rebellions. Their once unshakable faith in divine favor curdled into paranoia, accusing their own priests of heresy, burning suspected traitors without trial. By the time Poland and Lithuania delivered the final blow at the 13 Years' War's end in 1466, the Ordensstadt was already a hollow shell. The knights limped on as vassals, their castles repurposed as Polish granaries, their holy mission reduced to a diplomatic footnote. What lingers isn't just the ruins of Malbork's echoing halls, but the lesson etched into their crumbling bricks. No kingdom, no matter how fervent its beliefs, can thrive when it confuses conquest with righteousness. The Teutons built an empire on the premise that God rewards the ruthless, only to discover that even heaven has its limits. These 30 kingdoms leave us with a truth as timeless as the stones of their ruined castles. No throne, no matter how gilded, is immune to time's relentless tide. Look closely at their stories, and you'll see patterns repeating like echoes across centuries: the overreach of Charlemagne's heirs, the brittle pride of Byzantium's emperors, the way Mali's gold blinded its rulers to looming threats. Decline rarely comes from a single blow, but from 1,000 small fractures: taxes raised too high, borders stretched too thin, ears deafened to the whispers of change. The Mongols taught us empires can shatter under their own weight, while Burgundy's fate proved that even the richest courts vanish when they forget the difference between ambition and overreach. Yet these aren't just tales of ruin, they're blueprints for resilience. The kingdoms that endured longest, like England or France, learned to bend without breaking, swapping Viking raids for parliaments, feudal chaos for centralized law. Others, like Poland-Lithuania, remind us that systems built solely on noble ideals without the glue of practicality crumble when storms arrive. And then there are the quiet survivors, like Scotland or Portugal, whose identities outlasted their sovereignty, proving that a people's spirit often lingers long after their banners fall. So what's the lesson for us, scrolling through history in an age of algorithms and atom bombs? Perhaps it's this: civilizations thrive not by chasing eternal dominance, but by mastering the art of adaptation. The kingdoms we've explored didn't fail because they were weak. They failed when they confused yesterday's solutions for tomorrow's answers. As you close this chapter, think of the Byzantine walls that stood for 1,000 years, only to fall to gunpowder, or the Khmer engineers who tamed monsoons but couldn't foresee deforestation's cost. Their greatest legacy isn't in their glory or their collapse, but in the warning they leave for every generation. The measure of a society isn't how high it climbs, but how wisely it learns from the falls of those who came before. Now it's your turn. Which kingdom's story resonated most? Was it the tragic brilliance of the Abbasids' lost libraries, or the Viking kingdoms that dissolved into the cultures they conquered? Drop your thoughts below, and if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's forgotten turning points, hit subscribe, because the past isn't just a graveyard of empires, it's a mirror reflecting back the choices that might yet save or doom us all.